Michael Carter is an artist and educator working in objects, installation, and performance. He received his MFA from Claremont Graduate University. His work addresses metaphysical theories of art and the cultural roots of science, philosophy, and religion in modernity to the contemporary. His artworks and performances investigate and integrate the traditions of modern spirituality with a criticality born of scientific practices. Carter's artworks have been exhibited nationally and internationally, and he has given talks and lectures at institutions including the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, New York University, and the Ojai Valley Theosophical Lodge. About this time last year, I had the pleasure of being on a panel with Michael and scholar of esoteric music, Matt Marble. We talked about W.W. Harmon's esoteric manuscript, a very rare holding in our library, and it was really a pleasure to get to know him and learn from him then, and really looking forward to hearing more about his art and perspectives on art this evening. So please join me in welcoming Michael Carter.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome to my talk at the Cosmic Threshold, Re-Spiritualizing the Imagination in Contemporary Art. This talk is structured in a series of threes. I'm going to cover three major areas, talk about three formative experiences, and show how that plays out in three bodies of work. Then I'm going to end with three ideas about re-spiritualization. First, I want to talk about the personal. When I reflect on my development as an artist, there are three experiences that influence how I think about art now. They all happened to me when I was young, under 20. The first happened in New York City when I was not even 10, at the New York Earth Room, sometime in the late 80s. And when I saw this piece as a child, what stood out to me was a sense that I couldn't understand why someone would do this. And not in a negative way at all. It was such a remarkable and unexpected experience. What would cause someone to do this? Out of all the possible things that they could do in the world, why would they do this? As a result of that experience, this question has long been on my mind. What is the motivation of the artist? The second of these was an assignment in a foundation painting class. I was supposed to make an abstract painting. Part of the intent, obviously, was to churn over this idea. But when I asked about the execution of this assignment, the answers I got were odd, and they seemed incomplete. I was told an abstract painting is a painting with an ambiguous figure-ground relationship. However, already at this point in my life, I'd seen a lot of art, both in the States and Europe and Asia, and this answer also seemed very incomplete. It couldn't describe the broad range of abstraction, even just abstract painting I'd already seen. But the real question for me was, what on earth had happened? I was simultaneously learning the standard arguments and theories about how we moved from representational, naturalistic paintings to abstraction in the early 20th century. And yet, something seemed missing, something going back to this idea of motivation. The third, about a year later, was this assignment in a design class. The task was, draw an angry line. After we did, I was told that there was a correct answer. It was something like this, like a red, jagged line. That's an angry line. This is a basic kind of exercise, and now I understand completely the intent. There is an abstract expressionist-like connection between the emotion and the gesture, etc., etc. But digging into this later, I eventually learned this prompt emerged from Bauhaus pedagogy. And from this arises another persistent question. What are the roots of this idea? Where does this come from? Who decided that an angry line is a red, jagged line? So, shaped by these experiences, I started to look. And this was in the late 90s. The kind of tools we have now to research information did not exist in the same way then. The sense of just Googling it really wasn't there yet, and I didn't even really know what I was looking for. But then once, when I was digging around in a library, I encountered this phrase in a book. Kandinsky was a theosophist. It was almost a throwaway statement without any context or any further explanation, as if I was supposed to already know what that was. But I'd never encountered this word elsewhere or ever heard it spoken out loud before. And that brings us to the second point of the first three, and the events that inform how I make and do art, over the last 2 decades or so. You have it right. One has to grow into a state where he seeks nothing for himself, but takes whatever comes to pass as the thing he most desired. There's no room for the personal desire in this. A number of years later, I've moved to Los Angeles. One day I have to mail a package through FedEx. I have to do it at the very latest possible time. So I have to go to their main facility that's south of downtown in the warehouse district on West 33rd Street and Grand Avenue. Directly across the street from that FedEx building is this building. This is Theosophy Hall. When I saw this, I couldn't believe that's what I was seeing. It seemed completely impossible that this still existed. I knew by now this is what those artists had been interested in, but that's all I knew. On the side of the building, which was the main entrance at this point, there is this motto: there is no religion higher than truth. Really, the whole thing blew me away. A big part of the reason why is because I had no context for any of this. I couldn't place any of what I was seeing here, the symbolism, the language, what this was about. And unbeknownst to me at the time, this is actually a very special theosophical site. It's not actually part of the Theosophical Society, but it is the mother lodge of a sect of theosophists who are effectively orthodox theosophists. This community led the Back to Blavatsky movement that happened in the early years of the 20th century, largely against the second generation of the Society's leadership and events of the Krishnamurti-centered world teacher era. They're sort of like the Protestants of the modern theosophical movement. This would have very important implications for my question about abstraction and what was missing. What I encountered here, again, not really even understanding the significance of this or the rarity of it, was a small community who was studying mostly only the 19th century theosophical texts. In particular, they were doing regular and public study of the secret doctrine. And this, I hope you know, is Blavatsky's magnum opus from the 1880s, bringing together many concepts, but also introducing influential innovations. It is easily the most influential text of spiritual modernism. So, what have I discovered here? Because immediately this is strangely resonant with me. It's strange, but also completely improbable. I'm in a room at a big table with a dozen folks, mostly elderly, and they're all talking about Atlantis. Of all the possible things, this is it. This is what those artists are up to. It's like everything that's completely beyond the pale, concentrated into one place. And with something of a trickster spirit, I think back to what I was told in art school. The content of my art can be anything I want. I can do anything I want as an artist. So I decide I want to make re-engagement with whatever this is central to my work. It's clear to me that this whole thing is somehow completely and deliberately missing from all of my arts education and all of the arts discourse I've been exposed to. So what does this look like? I do the study and I internalize it. That leads to something like a theosophic effect. That is, it's an almost total destruction of the way I've thought about making art and being an artist up to this point. The thing that's most dismantled is the sense of the personal and aesthetic decisions. What is the source of these decisions? In regards to my formal choices, my subjectivity has been deeply questioned and nearly eliminated. Much later, I've noticed looking at some of the historic artists that we know were also influenced by theosophy and the secret doctrine in particular, that they also seem to experience this effect. If we look at the transitional work of Mondrian, for instance, he goes very quickly from these more naturalistic works, representational works, and then when he becomes very influenced by theosophical study, it leads to this total distillation of his work down to the most essential elements, in this case, the vertical and the horizontal and primary colors. It also seems to happen in Of Klint's transitional work, especially during the era of the Five. She goes from this academic way of working and seeing to this complete reduction to essentials. She ends up rebooting her work, starting with the primary colors and the spiral. Also there, I eventually discover what I believe is the real origin of the red angry line, Besant and Ledbetter's thought forms. It's literally one of the examples of a thought form, murderous rage and sustained anger. What thought forms argues is that the formal, shape, color, etc., emerges from psychospiritual processes and systems. By aligning what I do with this greater spiritual kind of understanding, I can't make art the way I've made art before. The personal has been overshadowed by the impersonal forces. So, like in an alchemical process, I've been dissolved down to this point where I basically can't make any sort of formal decisions that arise from the personal or subjective. What restarts my process is looking back to historic metaphysical systems, contemporizing these systems in an art context, and surrendering my aesthetic decisions to the result that emerged from these processes. This way of making art has strong resonances to recent generations. Although unfortunately rather obscure now, writer and theorist Jack Burnham coined the term system aesthetics in the late 1960s to describe new work he was observing during this era. Burnham thought this kind of art that highlighted not materials or objects, but relations between people and the components of their environment marked the transition into a systems-oriented culture. Thus, an aesthetics not from things, but from the way things are done. Not coincidentally, Burnham was also a keen student of the Kabbalah and was part of a generation of theorists who began looking towards the Western esoteric tradition to explain certain more inscrutable art of the 20th century. Burnham's particular interest was the influences of the Kabbalah on the work of Duchamp, going so far as to use the diagram from the Tree of Life from the Secret Teachings of All Ages in his writing on Duchamp's The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even. Burnham can be challenging to read, but if this topic interests you, I highly recommend his work. And now, this brings us to the second group of three, nested within the impersonal. The pendulum. In thought forms, there are images that are widely known, these forms that are visible to the clairvoyant, that emerge from thoughts, intentions, and emotions. This is what the red jagged line is. You think an angry thought, you have a murderous intention, and on the astral plane, according to the text, you literally manifest these specific forms. But starting from a place of clairvoyance, I'm not having clairvoyant experiences, I think. This seems like another version of the personal and subjective. Plus, the Orthodox theosophical study I was participating in was very critical of these kind of powers. However, there's more in thought forms than this. The opening chapter is basically an argument for visualizing the invisible world. Remember, this is an era when materialist science is discovering radiation, radio waves, the microscopic scale, etc. Everywhere, the invisible is being made visible. These particular images are generated by an harmonograph, which is basically like a Victorian parlor amusement. By adjusting the weights and their ratios, different forms are produced by the pen attached to the top. I try a little bit, but I can't figure out the engineering to make my own harmonograph. But I figured out with a single pendulum, though, and a vessel for ink or paint. I make this pendulum out of some very provisional materials, a weight out of concrete, sandbags, a photography backdrop stand, and some hardware. And I'm off, and I can start making images like these. I'm sure you know how this is done. I set up the device, I set it into motion, and gravity drives the system. My only further input is to choose when it's done. I iterate some of the basic elements of this process, paper and paint, and then this is the 9th one, and something really different happens here. It seemed special and different, and I couldn't completely quantify why. Attempting to understand, I scale up the process, and I begin to make them in larger numbers. I end up making 40 or 50 of these over the course of a year. Here's a selection of them from an exhibition at Loyola Marymount University in 2017. One of the things that stands out right away is that they're always different. They're always unique, and I can't predict the outcome exactly, what's going to happen in the process, and how it's going to turn out. I try for a little while to replicate this number 9, and I can never really get it. It's always a bit different. Just the smallest variation in the inputs to the system produces distinct outcomes. At the time, I start to think of them as little universes or little galaxies. Change the starting conditions just slightly, and you get a different universe. At the same time, my intention for these smaller works was to be studies for larger ones. And there's also a growing insight that I could do these as performances, which was always my main goal. And so that's what I do next. Here's the first at scale. And the first public performance, 2016, that one is 10 foot by 10 foot. The performances take about 30 minutes for the whole thing to execute. And the same piece later on in a gallery setting. This actually ends up on the other side of the world in a group exhibition at Nicodim Gallery in Bucharest. So it goes all the way from Eagle Rock to Bucharest in 2017. I do another performance in LA at the same gallery as part of another group exhibition. This one goes in a completely unexpected direction. If you look at me there, my expression in my face, I'm watching it and I literally don't understand why it's doing what it's doing. It's doing something I've never seen one of these do before, live in a performance at the gallery. And I'm totally baffled by it. Why the result is so different. I continue to scale these up. Here's the biggest one I did at Glendale Community College. It's 15 feet by 15 feet. This one was done off the bridge that connected the science department to the humanities department, which seemed particularly symbolic. And this one is right here from the Philosophical Research Society in 2018. This was the first one that was accompanied by a soundbowl performance. Kristen, who used to do soundbowl performances here, I think she still does regularly. And that sound bowl performance spanned the duration of the pendulum's movement. The audio element has become a regular part of these performances now. And here's the outcome of that one in an exhibition here in the gallery in the back. Just like the smaller scaled works, there is an unpredictable quality in these performances. There is a drama to how this unfolds. This one, for instance, you can see that the paint doesn't flow evenly from the pendulum, but it never completely stops. Repeated over the duration of the performance, it becomes a pattern. I started to notice an uncanny relationship between the place, the setting, the whole experience, and the outcome. What is my relationship with the people hosting the performance? What is my psychological state that day? What are the conditions at the site? Somehow these seem to end up in the piece. So again, there is this process of surrendering to whatever happens. I create the space, I set it in motion, and then I get out of the way. I'm giving up control, giving up authorship. My one intervention is to decide when it stops. This is similar to the way that notions of automatic writing and drawing or spiritualist art are discussed today. Now at this time, the next body of work emerges out of my experiences with the pendulum. I've been working exclusively in black and white for about 5 years. Additionally, thanks to the power of social media, this pendulum technique has now become a full vernacular art trend. It's everywhere, and I have to evolve what I'm doing. Reflecting on what I've learned and thinking about how I might better fit these works within a gallery ecosystem, I'm drawn to the reality of their uniqueness, their individuality, and their contextual influences on the outcome. What comes out of this is a sense I can make something like a portrait with this process, an energy portrait, like a more dynamic version of an aura photo. I want to directly integrate an individual into the process. Also, I've encountered another pivotal text of the second generation theosophy, and that's Leadbeater's Man, Visible and Invisible. This is certainly the most influential text of the 20th century about the aura, and actually predates thought forms by a few years. According to this theosophical view, the first place a thought form becomes visible to the clairvoyant is within the aura. Also appearing in Man, Visible and Invisible is this key to the meanings of color. The same chart appears again in thought forms. This chart is an early example of a systematized set of colors connected to psychospiritual states. So red is anger, light blue is spirituality, orange is pride, green is sympathy, etc. I work out a system with these ideas, but again without the clairvoyant aspect. These would be created in a process with the subject where they would select from certain prepared color combinations by intuition, and that would become the surface for the work. Now, introducing color for the first time in years, I start with the most essential elements, the primaries. It all comes together in a process of working that looks a little like this. This is the first study emerging from that process. I don't exactly know what to do with the figure yet, so here it is in gold leaf. 3 more. The other thing I'm reflecting on at this moment, the pandemic has started, and we're simultaneously awash in conversations about the body and identity and how we are defined or not defined by the physical body. But it's impossible to have engaged in metaphysical study, especially one permeated by Eastern and Southeast Asian traditions, and not encounter this admonishment. We are not just the body. This way of thinking is the crudest kind of materialism. The issue of how to represent the body, the spiritual body, continues to be on my mind. The figure here is basically a symbol for something I haven't figured out. I iterate on this separately from the pendulum. Notions of the cosmic enter my work at this time. But the pandemic grinds on, and it's challenging to get people into the studio for these energy portraits. Also, I've begun to drift away from the Orthodox Theosophical community I've been studying with the previous decade. I find out there is an exhibition coming to LACMA soon, the most significant exhibition about the Transcendental Painting Group, who were also deeply influenced by their theosophical studies. Having recently done a well-received lecture on Hilma af Klint on this same stage, I decided to embark on another lecture about the Transcendental Painting Group, a focus on the Los Angeles connections, specifically Agnes Pelton and Dane Rudyard. This leads me to reading Rudyard's first book on astrological theory and practice, The Astrology of Personality. It hits me like a truck. You see, it's rooted in Blavatsky's theosophy. It turns out that modern astrology emerges from theosophical reform of the astrological practices of the 19th century. But astrology is also clearly one of those master keys, and learning the foundation transforms my understanding of what I've learned the previous decade plus. I come to see astrology can be thought of as a fundamental identity, a non-physical identity that anticipates physical embodiment. So now I've got a completely different approach to representing the spiritual body. I make this work then the astrological self, a transitional piece between the radiant bodies and the next line of work. So that's glyphs for the sun, the moon, and the rising, and the colors are derived from my own natal chart. And now, astrology portraits. This organic whole, the individual person, is essentially no different from the almost infinitely greater and vaster organized whole, which we call the universe. The individual person is this individual whole focused at a particular point in space in terms of the particular need for it at the exact moment of its emergence into independent existence. I'm able to do this by passing this insight back through another body of theosophical materials, this time Blavatsky's esoteric instructions. These predate thought forms and man visible and invisible by decades and are actually the source of the concepts in those later books. These instructions were first distributed as pamphlets to the most committed society members and required making certain oaths and pledges to receive. These were, for a while, the secret teachings. It's actually in these instructions where the specific doctrines that go on to influence modern art, music, and astrology originate. In these instructions, there is a diagram, this one, diagram 2. I believe this is the most significant modern correspondence chart and can be shown to influence spiritual modernism up to the present day. This chart is, I believe, the first place where we see the combining of the modern color spectrum, the Newtonian one of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, with the koshas, the subtle bodies of the yogic system, and the planets, the 7 sacred planets. I don't believe this has ever been done before. It's an interesting side note to realize that Newton ends up with 7 colors, definitely because of his own hermetic commitments and interests. So there is already rooted in this color system this metaphysical understanding at its base. It's certainly where the now ubiquitous chakra pole with a red at the root and a violet at the crown comes from. It's so influential that we can see in the decades following its impact on theosophical artists of the early 20th century. That's on the left from the Harman manuscript that Devin mentioned earlier, that's at the library here at the PRS. And then the next one is Himolf Klint's altarpiece, the center of that triptych. And then the next is Olga Frobe-Kaptian's Central Spiritual Sun. And finally, that's Emil Bystrom's Creative Forces. And so these are all produced within 10 or 15 years of each other in the early 20th century. So how does this work? If you know a little bit about astrology, there's a few key elements to reading a chart, and one of these is aspects. An aspect is an angular value between any 2 points or elements of a chart. It can be 2 planets, it can be the ascendant and a planet, etc. Like the positions of the planets in the sky, it's also empirical, and it's consistent regardless of what kind of astrology or astronomy you're doing. In modern astrological theory, these aspects inform of particular conditions, strengths, or challenges in this lifetime. So, using diagram 2, I can correspond these 2 points to colors, numbers, glyphs, metals, etc. So there is an astrological consultation with the subject. We select an aspect that resonates with their lived experience, and that becomes the basis for the formal choices in the piece. So the first one I do is Mars square Jupiter. And according to the diagram 2 chart, Jupiter is blue, Mars is red, and they're also associated with the numbers 5 and 1. And I synthesize these correspondences into a piece. In the beginning, I simply get a small wooden panel. This one is like 8 by 12 inches, and adapt it. And this is Mars square Jupiter for Michelle. There's also a quartz crystal at the bottom, and I'll get back to that a little later. As soon as I start making these, I get a number of commissions for them quickly. The next one I do is the same process and comes out with Mars opposite Neptune. And this immediately presents an issue. Because if you go back to diagram 2, there's no outer planets on this chart. There's no correspondence for anything beyond the original 7 sacred planets. So I have to figure this out. How do I represent Neptune? Interestingly enough, there is a hue in the visual spectrum which does not exist within red to violet. So it exists outside of the Newtonian 7 colors. And that's magenta. Its wavelength is above red, but below infrared. So in magenta, I have a potential color correspondence. But what about a number, or more importantly, a shape? We need to dive into the sacred geometry in spiritual modernism to get that. What almost no one recognizes is that the secret doctrine begins with a description of art. Literally the first sentence, first volume, page 1. It's a description of what we'd now call tantric art. A few pages later, Blavatsky lays out a sequence of symbolic geometry. She says this sequence is the whole of the secret doctrine. In the first volume of the SD, she details the first 4, and in the esoteric instruction, she presents the other 3. These exact symbols, in order, make an appearance in thought forms. What's important to see here is that this kind of sacred geometry and number symbolism that underlies so much of the Western and Eastern esoteric traditions can be located within this sequence or its extension. You can continue stepping up the number endlessly until you arrive back at the original circle. It all begins from the circle and the point, the solar symbol, but also the symbol of cosmogenesis, the individual soul, and of subjectivity. But like magenta, there is also a form, sacred geometry, that is beyond this sequence. You may have done this before. You take a pin, string, and a pencil, and you can draw a circle. The mark of the pencil is constrained by attachment to the central point. You can also use the exact same materials to draw a perfect ellipse, except the ellipse forms by the relationship between the 2 foci, constraining or releasing the pencil. An ellipse is like the first shape that has two centers of influence or has two origins. I like the symbolism of this a lot. Not only the ellipse as a planetary orbit, but the emerging astrological interpretations of the outer planets focus on their greater than a lifetime orbital periods. Their interpretation points to the character of communities, generations, eras, etc. They are transpersonal planets. From all of that, I get this: Mars opposite Neptune for Pietro. And next, Pluto. Pluto opposite the Sun for Aaron. So for this, I think about below violet for the color correspondence is down towards the ultraviolet. I use the circle here because of its relationship to the glyphs for the Sun and Pluto. And earlier this year, an exhibition of these here at the PRS, the outer planets. And now, in time and in space, or on the threshold of the cosmic. In heaven, there is laid up a pattern which he who chooses may behold, and beholding, set his own house in order. The secret doctrine in the stanzas given here occupies itself chiefly, if not entirely, with our solar system, and especially with our planetary chain. So far, I've been talking about the past, where we've been, and how we got to the present. Now I'm going to highlight a trajectory towards the future. To move forward, we need to understand and consider what has happened in recent cosmology. A lot of people know this image. It's all over the place. It gets made into memes, it's put on t-shirts. This is the Flammarion engraving. It was actually created and first published much later than most people realize. I think people believe it is a medieval woodcut, but it was actually published in 1888 in Flammarion's Atmosphere, Popular Meteorology. The same year, Scottish astronomer Isaac Roberts publishes this image, the first published astrophotography of Andromeda. The Flammarion engraving and this photo of Andromeda are contemporaneous. However, astronomy doesn't really know what Andromeda is at this time. How big is it? How far away is it? It looks like a cloud of gas. Remember, at this point, the universe is still our solar system. It's also helpful to know this: the timing of the discovery of the outer planets. The sequence and dates of these discoveries is really illuminating. Another way to think about this transition into modernity is the change in cosmology I'm about to highlight. It spans the discovery of the outer planets. So what's depicted in the Flammarion engraving is the story of a traveling missionary who, reaching the top of a very high mountain range, is able to stick his head through the firmament, through the sphere of the fixed stars, and he beholds the structure of the transcendent there, what is beyond the firmament. This concept of spheres and firmaments is very old. There are examples from Mesopotamia that are 5,000 years old. This one is the Hebrew cosmology, a little later and derived from those Mesopotamian ones. It all maps pretty easily onto our subjective experience of the world. What really interests me is that outermost sphere, though, heaven, the dwelling place of God. Even though heaven is transcendent, it can be located physically in this scheme. It's beyond or above the fixed stars. And right, so our experience of when we look up into the sky at night is that there are only a few number of things that are moving. All the rest of the stars move together in a big group, and that's what makes the fixed stars or the firmament. I learned recently that one of the names of Yahweh in the Torah is actually Ha-Makom, which literally means the place, as in the place that contains all things. This idea that heaven is up is very old. This cosmological model persists for millennia. There's a version for the medieval era. From the bottom, those are the elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And then the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the fixed stars. These are the planetary spheres in order of their orbital durations, sometimes called the Chaldean order. And then above that, the transcendent heaven, the dwelling place of God. A couple of centuries later, this is the front plate of Kircher's The Ecstatic Journey. Heliocentrism has come back into vogue. Telescope technology is rapidly advancing. There are moons around Jupiter. Our moon is in orbit around the Earth. But look at how the cosmic is represented. Still the firmament, and beyond is the transcendent, the dwelling place of God, the cloud of unknowing and the unspeakable tetragrammaton, unknown and unknowable in this life. So, putting together these two images, we get a foreshadowing of what's to come. Empiricism has pierced the firmament, pierced the veil. The boundary of the unknown and unknowable is receding. And this very quickly changes our cosmology. This is Hooker Plate 335, an astrograph by Edwin Hubble taken at Mount Wilson Observatory on October 6, 1923. It's a negative. That's Andromeda again. This plate should be far more famous than it is. On this particular evening, Hubble identifies a star of variable intensity inside of Andromeda. They're able to use that information to calculate the distance of Andromeda from the Earth. The calculation comes out with these fantastic numbers. It's millions of light years away. This is not a cloud of glass. In our solar system, this is an enormous structure at an incredible distance. And almost overnight, the universe goes from about this big to about this big, and the size shift is mind-boggling. This realization quickly enters into popular consciousness. Here's the cover of the New York Times Magazine from August 1929. The star stuff that is man. Out of the surveys of the far-flung universe, science presents a new vision of the cosmos in which we are pictured as part of a magnificent creation, startling in its gigantic expanses. And below it says, "We are made of star stuff and part of a magnificent creation." This is the origin moment for modern popular cosmology of the 20th century. I get introduced to this decades later via Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Because the cosmos is also within us, we're made of star stuff. We are the way for the cosmos to know itself. The curious thing is that this is not a new idea. This is often presented with the subtext of an unprecedented breakthrough, but it's actually a very consistent story of human origins. You find it in Orphic totem passes 2,500 years ago. It's central to Plato's Timaeus and appears in the Phaedrus. 600 years later, here's a version from early Christian scholar Origen of Alexandria. This ascent through the spheres would have been familiar to any number of ancient cultures. To arrive at the transcendent heaven, the soul must ascend. And I particularly appreciate this quote from Origen because he literally says that there's a physical kinship between people and the stars. He even describes the destination of resurrected souls beyond the fixed sphere, beyond the firmament, to the true heaven. If we think back to the scheme of things woodcut, this kind of language emphasizes the transcendent as a location. It is beyond or above the fixed stars. So this gives us another very literal way to understand the transition into modernity. What was transcendent is now perceivable and knowable. So thinking back to that quote from Plato about the pattern in heaven, which may be beheld, and thus set our house in order. This is super interesting. So what exactly is up there? Initially, is a scaling up of the center and periphery structure. The outer solar system can be characterized again by the center, the circle with the point, the ego, the sun, the individual. This continues up to the Milky Way level, center and periphery. But beyond the Milky Way, it starts to get very interesting, which is now instead of having a single center, we start to observe groups and clusters. There is no one center, but multiple centers. Beyond that, it gets vaster and vaster. These scales are just enormous. What we get are groups of clusters and filaments. These are superstructures of thousands and millions of galaxies and other kinds of cosmic structures. And this continues up to the largest structures observed so far. The cosmic web, filaments and walls of galactic superstructures that form the boundaries between voids. And we're no longer even sure if the Big Bang works how we thought it did either, that everything is expanding from a central point. The largest scale, the universe appears to be a vast interconnected web without a center. Literally, everything is connected. If you think back to this sequence from the secret doctrine, we've completely left behind the sense of what's communicated in these symbols. There is no center anymore. These cosmic scales begin to appear very quickly in spiritual systems of the 20th century. Here's a diagram from Rodney Collins' The Theory of Celestial Influence. It still echoes that 15th century medieval woodcut, except the elements have been replaced by an intricate biological scheme. The planetary spheres have been replaced by a heliocosm with outer planets, the firmaments by the Milky Way, and the whole scheme proceeding as rays from the transcendent, the Absolute. There's also a group of mid-century new spiritual movements that really pick up these revelations and run with them. These are, of course, cosmic religions, UFO religions, UFO cults, whatever you want to call it. Once again, we seem to be really beyond the pale. Regardless of what you think about it, they arise from engaging with the implications of this newly expanded universe. These remain at the leading edge of contemporary spirituality today and are also a unique product of Los Angeles. Every one of these groups has elements that trace back to events from this era or have established a physical presence here. So, and to close out this original three, this brings me back around to the astrological portraits with their crystals. This is George King on Holdson Down in England. He's performing one of the spiritual missions of the movement he founded, the Aetherius Society. They call this Operation Prayer Power. They're directing prayers into a device on the tripod, a spiritual battery. Here's King and his most important channeled texts, the 9 freedoms and the 12 blessings. These are the foundational spiritual texts of the Aetherius Society. Inside this battery is a matrix of quartz crystals. The idea here, if you're unfamiliar with the metaphysical uses of crystals, is that the quartz crystals' piezoelectric qualities have a sympathetic magic-like ability to also receive and hold spiritual energy and its intention. So in this mission, they are charging the device with prayers to be later directed and discharged towards specific needs, such as towards communities suffering from natural disasters, wars, etc. They literally take that thing on the tripod and they insert it into another device. And that device is sort of like a radiator that they point to different parts of the world to do this. So I incorporate a procedure like this into the astrological portraits as the final step, an overtly metaphysical step of the fabrication. I read out an affirmation-like script related to the particular aspect embodied in the piece. The intention is to ameliorate the issues indicated. The piece becomes a focus for this intention, similar to the theory of a sigil. So just like the spiritual technologies in Operation Prayer Power, the astrological portraits become receptacles for intention, and the artwork a vessel to hold this intention. And now, that brings us to the final 3 in this presentation. In order to create an enlightened society, you have to change the culture. In order to change the culture, you have to change the art. In order to change the art, you have to change the principles that art is based on. Spiritual is a very tricky term discursively. It's too vague, really. Discussing art, we have to be much more specific. So first I want to differentiate this term from one that circulated the last couple of decades, re-enchantment. I don't have confidence in re-enchantment. This is the line of thought saying that if we can step beyond the modern traditions of mechanism, positivism, empiricism, rationalism, materialism, secularism, and scientism, the whole objectifying consciousness of the Enlightenment, we can create a space for the return of the soul. That if we can see the world once again as enchanted, alive with spirit and spirits, filled with wonder, mystery, and magic, we can collectively heal the nihilistic habits supposedly introduced by modernity. Even more profound, though, is the realization that disenchantment is a myth. Modernity is already enchanted. There is no modernism without the New Age. This is not even to unpack the religious roots of the Enlightenment or the profoundly weird and metaphysical currents in scientism, capitalism, and neoliberalism. If you want a small taste of this, really look into the origins of the Big Bang Theory and the Catholic priest that first proposed it, or the role of the sublime in neoliberal economic theory. The misstep of re-enchantment is that it begins with a false view of modernism and then wants to proceed, like a reactionary, back to some moment before the fall. I think the aim is well-intentioned, but we'll never be able to return soul to the world again in a way that would be comprehensible to our pre-modern predecessors. We cannot return. Whatever it is that awaits us past the boundary of the unknown will take the form of something unimaginable to the past. We are evolving. So, what does re-spiritualization entail? That brings us to the final three. There is a line of discourse about whether art can change culture or change the world. I think change is a given. Change is a constant, and it's also unavoidable. What I want to do is be intentional about that change. Re-spiritualization is about changing emphasis. The first of these is intention. What do you, as an artist, imagine is the outcome of the effort you put into your work? What is on your mind while you make that work? Of course, we just passed through an era, the postmodern, where we spent a lot of time critiquing intention, death of the author, impossibility of ultimate meaning, etc. Yet, coming from the direction of metaphysical practice, the reality of intention is unavoidable. The intention, the state of mind, the energy we put into every act shapes the result and how it operates in the world. Only the artist can set the intention of the art. Art has function and utility in the world, an invisible and equally fabricated structure beyond its material one. Our intention as artists shapes this structure. The second is audience. Who is your art for? Who are you trying to communicate with? Who is your community? Are you making art for that community or for someone else? I am pessimistic about art as self-expression. I suspect the 20th century emphasis on self-expression through art is a historical artifact linked to the zeitgeist of the post-war generation. In my own art education, I can't recall this question of audience ever coming up. I think the hidden assumption is that if the artist is pursuing their own individualistic self-realization, that this will align itself with societal needs. This is the invisible hand of the market thinking, but for artists. If we're honest about the current dynamic, artists are largely making art for a vague audience, the art world, collectors, the public, in pursuit of individual recognition and acceptance. There is something of the character of the devil in this current ecosystem. We're making work for an opaque audience within a system that prioritizes optimizing the extraction of value, driven by the artist's desire for personal recognition. I guess it works, but it's little wonder we have the art world that we have now. And that brings me to the third point. The greater good. So far I've emphasized intention and audience. Now I want to aim a little higher. Can your intention grow to include other people? Can your aim also serve the interests of others? There is, of course, work like this already, social practice, public practice, etc. But even the most traditional and formal kinds of art can lean towards these ends by how it is shown, where it is shown, who comes to possess it, and what aims they have in the act of acquiring it. I want that we as artists should become more conscious of these function, the life and life cycle of our art. Thinking back to that scheme of heaven again, the cosmic web, what we behold is a vast network of interconnectedness. Intention is the character of our node in this network. Audience is what is most immediately connected to us, but the greater good is the larger picture, where the node's individuality dissolves into a greater whole, no longer a node. If re-enchantment wants us to return the soul, I'm encouraging you not to think about the personal soul so much. I want you to think about spirit, the supra-personal, and the transpersonal. We're on the threshold of understanding humanness as both individualism and interrelated in ways greater than we have ever considered before. It is on the basis of this higher self that we must relate and we must situate our value. Our true identity is this cosmic self. And finally, I wish you peace within yourself, love to guide you, and to bliss. May you heal yourselves in all ways. Thank you. I think that's it. I think we have time for any questions, if there's any questions from the audience. Okay. Oh, wait, somebody. Okay.
I'm very curious, Michael, how you are connecting like current art book practices to that tarot card at the specific.
I think if I think back to my experience, especially in the situation of creating artists, so the pedagogy of artists, we rarely ever talk about. We are encouraged, like I said, again, to do like the Burden quote: "Do your own thing. You can do whatever you want." This is still, I think, something I see over and over again. So there's very little, in my experience, conversation about like what is the ultimate end of this? What are we doing with these things? Who is the audience for this work? If anything, it seems like, we're largely making, if we think about work designed for a gallery system, for a handful of collectors, like 20 people maybe, hoping that somehow the work that we do will appeal to this very small audience of people. Otherwise, we're directing work towards the public, which is an equally opaque audience. So it seems to be, at least in terms of the way we are creating artists at this moment, that we oftentimes are saying, express yourself. We don't really know where this is going, but it's don't worry about that. And then primarily the commercialization or the monetization of work works by extracting value out of it, right? We produce things as artists, we produce it in numbers, and then someone comes along and says, okay, we'll take these 7 and then we'll show these. And there's not even necessarily a connection between the work that I do in the studio and where it ends up. I mean, I've talked to artists who are very established here, who have very long exhibition records, who are widely collected, who don't know where a majority of their work is. Like, where did it go? Who has it? And I see that happen over and over again. So I'm like, who are you making this work for? Why is this the particular system that we are working under? Is there something else? Yeah, I think so. The part of your continued question was the idea of the stories of the devil or bargains with the devil for the people who are watching online. And so they, and to what extent our experience, like again, buying into a neoliberal system, which seems to be driven by the ideas of self-expression or certain economic models, how that seems to relate to stories of deals with the devil. And I think part of the thing is too with this is the tarot of the devil, which actually has also particular meanings in the imagery. And part of the particular imagery of this one here is that if you look at those 2 people who are bound up to the devil, the sort of like lesser devils, they're chained, but the chain is actually loose. It can be removed at any time. So there is a degree like of what you're saying. You are slave to the devil, but you are buying into it as well. So I think that that's part of that. The specific reading of this tarot card is also what I was looking at. Like, yes, we are all as artists buying and contributing into a system that is aimed towards really opaque ends. And I wish that we would have discuss more like what do we do, what is happening, where's the destination of this work, what is your bigger intent with it, who is it for? Yeah, I mean, so the question was about the Earth Room, and to what extent when Walter de Maria created that Earth Room with the backing of the Dia Foundation, how much of the audience was known at that time? I mean, that's an interesting question. I would love to know. I don't know rigorously all the context of what happened in the creation of that work, and putting it in a although it was obviously not as densely trafficked part of Manhattan at that time, it was still putting it in a context where it's situating it indefinitely a kind of community there. So it'd be curious. I would love to know more actually about all of the context of the creation of that work. Oh, so the question was about the relationship between the tarot card and the unconscious and the intention, and it in a sense like Kundalini, right? The rising of Kundalini. I feel like there are many parts to that question. What? Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit suspicious of the whole idea of unconscious in general. I mean, I think about looking at the origin of the ideas of the unconscious, and especially in the early 20th century. I wonder how much of that is a convention that we're using to describe an experience, as opposed to something which is actually objectively measurable. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think I'd have to think about that question more. Yeah, I think so. The question was about re-enchantment and the idea of an enchanted modernity. There is a really strong set of impulses, right, that are coming into the early 20th century, that we're talking about the end of Christianity, essentially, and we're moving into a more secularized environment. And again, things like the development of Freudian psychology. Finally, we have a way to explain the motivations of people. We are seeing advances in sciences where things that maybe we didn't have the same kind of explanations for, now we have new ways to talk about them. So there's this set of forces that are operating in the early 20th century that seem to indicate that we are experiencing the disenchantment of the world, right? Which is to like coin Max Weber's phrase. What now is emerging in the scholarship is that none of that is much more complex and what's the word? Compromised, in a sense, that was itself a certain kind of mythological narrative, and that we really would begin to look at the origins of these things. The work that I showed, these books here, the one on the myth of disenchantment there, super recommend it. It's a fantastic study of what many of these intellectual figures of the early 20th century were actually engaged with, where their motivations were coming from, where their particular concepts originated. So, like, for instance, I mentioned the Big Bang Theory, right? The Big Bang Theory is a result of the work of a priest in Belgium, a Catholic priest, who was also a physics professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And he wore like a frock and a collar, and every day he would do mass. And he would literally walk from his, I've been there, there's his office at the university, and you walk out the front door and you look directly to the left is the local church, and that's where he would walk every day to do mass. And so when Father George Lemaitre first proposed the Big Bang Theory, all of the other astronomers of the era were like, "You're ridiculous. All you're doing is trying to recreate Genesis because you're a Catholic priest." And it was only because of the work that Edwin Hubble did out here in Southern California to document the sort of what they thought was the movement of everything in the heavens, everything in the sky away from a central point, the red shift, the blue shift, that became a solid theory. So it's like you start to realize, like, wait a minute, like the idea of the Big Bang is actually still very much rooted in our Christianized culture. It's not really as much of a break as we have been telling ourselves for the last century. And so the fact that now we're at a point in astronomy where they're starting to say, yeah, when we actually double check all these things, when we look at different places in the sky and we further verify Hubble's work, it actually doesn't work. Like things are moving at different rates. They're not moving the same in some places. So already that theory is starting to disintegrate. So it's kind of like some of these things, there's kind of this break that happens, or this idea that there is a break in the early 20th century and that modern culture represents a total break from everything before it. But in many ways, it looks like it's really just the continuity. It's a continuation. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about what is the direction forward, right? We have these existing sort of destinations for art, whether it's a gallery system, institutional space, public or online spaces, and sort of participating in things the way they are, or is there the potential to sort of continue with that participation, but with a new consciousness? Yeah, and so I think more on the second side of it. I don't think you can escape those. I think those systems, those destinations exist for a reason. And the idea that we can, as artists, build, some entirely new territory to make work. It's like the idea that the work is itself always, that it could ever been just art for art's sake, or that it could have been, there is some new, Susie Gableck's text there is amazing. It's like she basically in the late 80s attempts to map out some of these similar questions and comes to a lot of the same conclusions that you can't escape. There's really no way out. And you can't create art outside of the system. But at the same time too, it's like there's all of these functions that even the most basic formal art has, a simple painting does have all of these utilities and functions in a social cultural world. And so I think that we need to be, like you said, as artists, more conscious and coherent of what all of these works are doing in the world, because they are all serving functions. They are collected and acquired and showed for very certain reasons. And I think that that's what I'm looking for is, I think about a lot of this, the re-spiritualization. We're clearly in an era where, art is being more defined by not the artist or the intellectual, but by the economic system that's attached to it. That seems to be the total definition at this point. And I think part of this re-spiritualization is about trying to pull some of that power back towards the artist, in that, to make ourselves more conscious of how our art is being used and the way that it is being circulated. And there was one over there.
Yeah, I love the repetitious nature of the work, and I'm curious about the transition, which seems like you work on a body of work for a considerable amount of time. You can do those ideas. I'm curious about, with you as an artist, what that freedom transition is like when you're going from one kind of body of work into another. And the second part of that question is, where do you find yourself now in your work? What stage?
Yeah. So the question was about the bodies of work and the transition between those bodies of work, and the way that I'm working on one thing and then switching, and then also where do I find myself now? I so much of this has been a process of that there's no guidance, and a lot of it is I'm also, as I'm making the work, I'm also doing the metaphysical study and learning the history and those kinds of things. So it's like my consciousness is changing. And so whatever I'm making at a particular moment is like, oh, I figured out how to bridge these two worlds that in many ways are not connected. And so how can I do, in a sense, what those historic artists were doing, where they're reading, this spiritual text or having a particular experience, and then using that process, that system, to make some kind of art. So the most obvious one might be something like automatic drawing, right? So early. There we go. Right. And so there's like a direct example of like, how can we do something formal that comes from a direct kind of, we're doing automatic drawing, it's a relationship to a seance, and it's producing something that looks like art or is a formal process. And so the whole thing that I've been trying to do is like find other systems. So it's like, I was like, okay, I can work with the pendulum, right? I can use these astronomy systems to make portraits. So there's all these ways. And so it's always kind of like, I exhaust the possibilities of a particular way of working, and that starts to reveal itself that there's less coming out of the system at that time. And so then it becomes influenced by something else. So right. So I'm like, oh, this is great. I can put a person inside this pendulum system, and I can get something that's like a direct recording of that person, and iterate it in these ways, and then think about what I'm doing with the figure in general. And there's nothing about astrology in these. I don't have almost zero knowledge of astrological practice at this point. So when I get that, then that's what comes out. And I'm like, oh, wait, I'm trying to figure out how to think about other ways where especially at this moment when I'm making these work, there is so much identity related work that's operating in the art world. And I'm like, I want some other kind of way of talking about identity. I've been doing this spiritual practice. And one of the things that comes over and over again is like, you are not this body, right? You are like, you are not just this body. So how can I show that? What's an immediate way to think about that? And then that what comes out as a sort of in-between work. So what I've been doing now, I'm just actually opening a solo exhibition in the Midwest next week. And it's sort of almost like a retrospective of a lot of these works. It has large scale pendulum paintings in it. It has a video piece about cosmological evolution. But what it also has is I've finally combined the figure and the pendulum painting into one. And instead of doing it in the negative, like these ones, it's a fully rendered figure. But so I mean, so the question is about like the relationship between the discovery of the planets and the theosophical teachings, but also the broader cultural historic events that are related to it. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think from a metaphysical symbolic aspect, we are just beginning to process the outer planets. I think so much of the discourse around them is literally, you can trace it back to something that Blavatsky said, like one sentence. And then many of the astrologers just ran with that. And so much of modern astrologer practice comes directly from theosophical texts. And that's something I think that broadly I don't see that a majority of practicing astrologers are aware of, and it's definitely not a historic understanding. So one of the things that I did recently was, I know the primary lecturer of theosophical topics in the Americas, right? And he's been here and he's talked on the stage many times. And I took a course with him that specifically was around the esoteric instructions, and I asked him these questions, and he was evasive about all of them. So I was like, what is the relationship of Neptune? And he's like, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, well, how were they using Uranus? And he's like, oh, it's really weird. They were associating with like the Atma, which doesn't make any sense to associate the planet with the highest principle. So the reality is, it's like the theosophical doctrine around these things hasn't entered the modern age at all. Even the second generation theosophical practices, like they just kind of like, we're not going to talk about that. So there's that. I think the question of these planets has been taken up more by astrological theory and by the UFO cultures, by astroculture. I think the difference in my work is that I'm not relying on the idea of being a channel or being a visionary. I think that that's the difference, but why I highlighted the idea of systems aesthetics here, because I'm not, I think like, for whatever kinds of visions or clairvoyant experiences I may or may have not had in my life, I don't I don't trust them enough to then make them the basis of what I'm building on. I think I have a more radical understanding of the spiritual, in a sense that I feel like I'm more interested in getting out of the way entirely. Like I think there's less that need for light, forces of light, forces of dark. I think that's something that I'm suspicious of in general, and want to just like it's all spirit. And so if I can just kind of like get out of the way and let it do its thing, that will result in what I want. I mean, so the second part of your question, in terms of Pelton's relationship between these ideas of dark and light forces, but also the unknown, I think it's the unknown that I'm really most interested in, because I feel like we are existing at sort of this transitional time period, and it's whatever the next step is, whatever sort of the advance of things, is not something that's going to come from conscious decisions, or come from repeating patterns, or come from necessarily building 100% on the past. So I feel like I'm trying to set up conditions for allowing that unknown to come through as strongly as possible. Yeah. The artists. I think what I'm discussing more is about changing the artists. So the question was about, do I see examples of these in artists currently, or do I see aspects of the art world where representing or reflecting these things yet? And I can't think of. I think it's interesting that there is this small community of people who are thinking about metaphysical art, or there's more people thinking about the idea of magic in relationship to art right now. And to me, those things are kind of compelling. But I don't know if broadly I see yet many examples. Like, I don't think we're there. And I also don't think this is something that happens in a lifetime. Like, oh, tomorrow we can make this change, and then we'll see in a couple of years the results. I feel like what we're talking about is a societal change that takes time. Okay. Thank you very much.